The Society for Culture and Environment extends a warm welcome. You are watching a session on the making of early Kashmir, landscape and identity in the Rajatarangini. Shonaleeka Kaul in conversation with Rima Hooja from the Bhopal Literature and Art Festival, January 2019. Ms. Shonaleeka Kaul is a cultural and intellectual historian of early South Asia and an associate professor at the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal National University. Ms. Rima Hooja is an archaeologist, historian, heritage consultant and writer. She is currently consultant director at the Maharaja Savai Man Singh II Museum, Jaipur, and managing trustee of the Jaipur Virasat Foundation. She is also a member of the Society for Culture and Environment.
So, namaskar everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here and speak about the making of early Kashmir. I want to thank Raghav Chandraji and the entire team for this warm invitation, and Rima Hooja ji for her kind introduction. With what time we have left today, I will begin by sharing a few thoughts, as I said, about why it may be important to read and talk about this book at all, and what are its implications, not only for the value of Kashmir, but also for the rest of the country. I will thereafter very quickly talk you through some visuals which support the findings that I will first tell you about. Now, what is this book about? The making of early Kashmir, I believe, is a new and thoroughly revisionist cultural history and anthropology of early Kashmir, which challenges a number of assumptions, misconceptions, and cliches that have flowered and gotten entrenched in academic, popular, and political circles in this country about the valley without much basis in historical reality. The book raises a set of three interrelated questions as necessary to the study of any region. A, what is history, and in what modes may we receive it? Is there only one way in which history is told, or can there be a diverse, culturally specific ways? Number two, how does a land become a homeland? How does that transition happen? And how are cultural identities formed in the long durée, historically? So my book explores these questions in relation to the birth of Kashmir by tracing the discursive and material practices both, that is ideational and material practices that shaped Kashmir's emergence right up to the 12th century CE, which means we are talking about some 2000 formative years in Kashmir's history. It's a short book, but don't go by appearances. This book begins by reinterpreting what is believed, erroneously by the way, to be the first work of Kashmiri history composed in the 12th century, namely Kalhan's Rajatarangini. Now, what is the Rajatarangini actually? Does it call itself a history? No, it says it is a prabandha or a mahakavya, that is a traditional epic Sanskrit poem. But 200 years of scholarship on Kashmir, starting with Harold Wilson in 1825, through Oral Stein, R.C. Majumdar, A.L. Bashan, down to Romila Thakur in recent times, all of them have told us that the Rajatarangini was the first and only work of history proper in all of Sanskrit literature. Why? Because it is giving dates and causation and so on. In other words, scholarly celebration of this one text was actually deprecation of an entire civilization. As Rima ji said, the implication is we didn't know how to write history before 12th century Common Era. I won't go into details of that, though I critique this heavily in the first chapter of the book. But this apart, even as these scholars isolated and adulated the Rajatarangini thus, they did something else which was quite contradictory. They disowned and dismissed those figurative aspects of the Rajatarangini that were typical of the traditional Sanskrit poem that it actually was. So what am I talking about? Myth. The fact that myth occurs in the Rajatarangini, rhetoric, didactic, education, instruction. These more typical, stereotypical aspects of a Sanskrit work in the Rajatarangini were pooh-poohed by these historians for 200 years, set aside and dismissed. Whereas these actually, if you read the 8,000 verses long text, these aspects actually constitute the bulk of this book. And yet 200 years of scholarship has denied this character. What do I do? Departing from this scholarship, I argue that this iconic text was history not despite being traditional Sanskrit poetry, but because of it. It organized Kashmir's past around a deeply ethical understanding of time and human action, the principles of dharma and karma, and employed popular memory, myth, rhetoric, and the didactic as crucial strategies, not contradictions of, strategies of its historical vision. That's not all. The Rajatarangini may have been trying to generate a history or temporality, but also, perhaps more importantly, a place for history or time. So this place that the Rajatarangini composes for history is Kashmir. And the writing of the history of Kashmir by Kalhan, I argue, was tied up with the creation of a homeland. How did it do that? Of course, read the book. But very briefly, the Rajatarangini elaborated what I call a poetics of place. It overlaid the geography of Kashmir with narrative. Myriad tales of gods, demigods, kings, and commoners tied to the physical features of Kashmir's landscape, inducing thereby a rootedness in the land and a sense of belonging. This composition of a landscape called Kashmir drew deeply on the sacred geography of the land, as well as a stringent and detailed critique of local politics, and, spectacularly, an idea of regional selfhood in the 12th century that aspired to transcend the narrow limits of local parochialism. So Kashmir's regionalhood or regional selfhood always saw itself as being the center of the universe rather than a periphery. I'll show you how that connects to the rest of my work. Further, exploring the question of identity. The making of early Kashmir combines text, that is the Rajatarangini, with also long-term testimonies from art, archaeology, script, and linguistics to jettison the entrenched image of an isolated, insular, and unique Kashmir. It proposes a cultural formation instead that straddled the Western Himalayas and the Indic plains, with Kashmir as the pivot. In fact, Bhaiya, can we just have the PowerPoint on so that we have the map? I know we all know what Kashmir is, but it helps to know the geography as well. This pehla slide ko dijiye, opening page. And this would also help. That's an in-focus view of the region. And what I argue in this book is that Kashmir, far from being an isolated outpost of the Indian subcontinent, performed the function of a pivot or a fulcrum of a new cultural formation that I propose, which straddles the Western Himalayas and the Indic plains. And Kashmir plays a central role in that. I'll show you how. So this is the story. This book is the story of Kashmir's connected histories with the rest of India. Let me spend the rest of my time today on this, because very frankly, in all my lectures across India and the world, wherever I've spoken on Kashmir, I discovered a disturbing reality, which is that how little everyone knew about Kashmir. Kashmir's historical truths. We all think we know a lot about Kashmir, but much of that turns out to be hype, propaganda, and disinformation. Why is this so? Why do we know so little? The reason for this is is both academic and political, and both neglect and misrepresentation. What am I speaking about? Perhaps the most glaring misrepresentation of Kashmir is the theory, very influential, very entrenched, that Kashmir has been historically secluded from the rest of India. Always. You will hear this in any number of talks, in any number of activist speeches. Arundhati Roy being a very recent case, and a video of hers went viral, where she categorically says, you know, Kashmir has never been a part of India, and one wonders what history she may have been reading. So this whole theory that Kashmir was historically secluded and therefore developed a cultural uniqueness. You will hear this a lot about Kashmir, and in good faith. Not everyone is trying to mean harm for Kashmir or to misrepresent her. They genuinely believe Kashmir is a unique culture. Now this needs historicization, it needs exploration. It has also been assumed retrospectively that Kashmiri culture, including the tradition of history writing, I must add, despite the fact that the Rajatarangini is a thoroughly Sanskrit text, it has been assumed that Kashmiri culture and history writing was influenced by West Asia and Central Asia, not India, because she was never a part of India. So you can see the circular reasoning. However, research shows that all cultural markers in early Kashmir, diagnostic of identity from at least the 5th century BCE onwards, so before the Common Era, for another 2000 years. What cultural markers am I speaking of? Material culture, archaeology, textual representations, foreign accounts, inscriptions, coins, language, art, religion, philosophy, you name it. All these markers, and I talk about this in the book, all of these, ladies and gentlemen, attest overwhelmingly to Kashmir's Indic and Sanskritic genesis and character. They also attest to her deep and extensive connections and mutual involvement, not just with neighboring areas like Punjab and Himachal, which can be expected, but with centers of Indic civilization in the deep interiors of India, like Patna, Nalanda, Gaya, Banaras, Allahabad, Mathura, Malwa, Saurashtra, that's Gujarat, Gaur, ancient Bengal, right down till Karnataka and Tamil Nadu in the deep south. The book has all the references that I'm speaking of. We are looking, ladies and gentlemen, at cultural transmission and communication of astonishing reach. And this is the 12th century BCE, CE and before. What did Kashmiris have in common with all of this? Sorry, that moved prematurely. I want to keep us here. Kashmiris looked to these places for politics, trade, education, asylum, employment, art, religion, philosophy, fashion. And I'll come back to that. Kannada fashion, couture, was actually in practice in Kashmiri courts in the 11th century. And pilgrimage. While people from different parts of India traveled to and settled in Kashmir over 2000 years for the same reasons. So massive and crucial was Kashmir's participation and presence in Indic affairs that about the second half of the first millennium CE, that is 500 CE onwards, she had come to lead many aspects of the cultural scene across the subcontinent. How did this happen if Kashmir was cut off from the rest of India? This is why in my book I have argued for moving away from the paradigm of unique history for Kashmir towards, or that of center and periphery, that these borderlands have always been peripheries of the Indic heartland somehow. I argue for moving away from this to the paradigm of connected histories, if the genesis and character of Kashmiri culture are to be correctly understood. Not just Kashmir's contribution to India, but Kashmir's own shaping entanglement, material and ideological, with the rest of India is truly incredible. Sample just a few formative facts of Kashmiri history of which most people are completely unaware. I was, to be very honest, before I began my research. Civilization comes to Kashmir at the same time as the rest of India. Did you know that? Circa 6th century BCE, and in the same form, designated as the northern black polished ware culture that is typically associated with the Gangetic Valley. Kashmir was a part of pan-Indian political formations from the very beginning too. That is, from the 3rd century BCE as a part of the Mauryan Empire that stretched across the subcontinent, I think you all know, and whose Emperor Ashoka founded, in fact, the city of Srinagar. How many of us knew that? Kashmir was also a part of the Indian realms, the Indian kingdom of the Kushanas, 2nd and 3rd century CE, and the Hunas, 6th century CE, which extended till Banaras in the east and the Malwa in central India, respectively. Kings, queens, and ministers of Kashmir were drawn from different parts of India across the centuries. Would you believe it that Kashmir and Gandhar being Peshawar, modern Peshawar, were known to be the political allies of Magad or Bihar? So if Pakistan wants Kashmir, they'll have to take Lalu Yadav as well. Kashmir also had close marital but just see the geographical spread we are talking about. Here is Kashmir and here is Bihar, across the width, in a sense, of India. They were political allies and functioning as such right from the time of the Mahabharata. Kashmir also had close marital and political histories with Pragjyotish or Assam. That's right across the Himalayas. That's quite mind-boggling. Also with Gaud or Bengal, and with Cholas or Tamilakam in the deep south. While rulers from Madhya Pradesh were on more than one occasion invited by Kashmiri ministers to be the king of Kashmir. Now that is something. In turn, the 8th century Kashmiri king Lalitaditya, you may have heard of him, undertook expeditions in parts of North India, including in Kannauj, that's Uttar Pradesh. And that this is not just myth or rhetoric is suggested by the fact that his coins have been found in huge hoards. I will show you some examples shortly, from different places in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, affirming the political and commercial presence of Kashmiris deep in the Ganga Valley, 8th century CE. That's not all. People from Punjab, Haryana, UP, Bengal, Malwa, Karnataka and Tamil Nadu are seen migrating and settling in Kashmir in the Rajatarangini across centuries. Settling in Kashmir, mind you, that has significant implications for the demography of that state and region. The earliest historical languages we have in Kashmir are Prakrit and Sanskrit, just like the rest of India. The vernacular tongue Kashmiri is itself an Indo-Aryan language with close affinities to archaic Sanskrit. The earliest script in Kashmir, writing system, was, for the most, the quintessential Indic script Brahmi from as early as 2nd century CE, and then its descendant, a descendant of Brahmi, Sharada, at least up to the 16th century. And I will also show, I argue in the book, that Sharada also became the script of this entire regional formation that I'm talking about, not only of Kashmir. So connections again. A long line of virtuoso Kashmiri poets and philosophers like Vaman, Udbhat, Mammat, Kshemendra, Anandavardhana, Abhinav Gupta, and these are spanning some 6-7 centuries, revolutionized Sanskrit aesthetics and literature, monopolizing the hugely significant intellectual scene across the country right into the 2nd millennium CE. Their works, how do we know this? Their works circulated widely and were studied as learned models even in the deep south. Something that a scholar of Tamil has recently described very colorfully as saffron in the rasam. Kashmiri art, I'll be showing you specimens, and sculpture in particular, has been traced in every one of its stages at Bijbihara, then Baramulla and Bandrethan, to the influence of Gupta and post-Gupta and Pala art styles from Sarnath, Udaygiri, very close to where we are, and Nalanda in Bihar. Did you know that this repertoire from Kashmir includes pan-Indic Buddhist and Hindu images such as Bodhisattva, Trimurti, Vaikuntha Vishnu, Maheshwara as Bhuteshwara, many Durga Mahishasur Mardinis, I'll show you some spectacular examples. 18 armed, Harihar, Ganesha, Kartikeya, and so on. Indeed, Kashmiris worship the same gods as the rest of India. Shaivism, Shaktism, and Buddhism in Kashmir are as old as Kashmir itself. And it is Kashmiris who took Buddhism from India to China and Central Asia. The Sharda temple that today lies derelict across the line of control in POK was visited by pilgrims from as far as Bengal in the 8th century, as early as that, and is listed in the 11th century by Al-Biruni, the Arab traveller, as one of the top 3 shrines of Al-Hind, or India. Great Indian philosophers like Nagarjuna and Shankara, so what I'm trying to say by that is the centrality. Kashmir may be parked up there in the north, but she was actually right at the heart of the imagination of the entire subcontinent, literary, cultural, intellectual, religious imagination. Great Indian philosophers like Nagarjuna and Shankaracharya, right from Kerala, taught in Kashmir, while Kashmiris themselves, did you know, frequented Gaya and Kashi so much that a 9th century Kashmiri minister actually sought tax exemption for Kashmiris at these sites. So thoroughly Indic thus are Kashmiri origins, and so crucial was Kashmiri participation in Indic affairs in the long durée. How did this happen if Kashmir was never a part of India? And yet, thousands of lives have been lost over this question. I believe the attempt to erase and forget this founding history from living memory may be at the root of the disinformation and conflict in the valley today. But history cannot be wished away simply because it doesn't suit politics. Allow me now very briefly to talk you through some images, and I will conclude after that. So this is the connected histories we are speaking of. This actually precedes even the narrative I gave you. I started from 6th century BCE. This is going right back to the Neolithic period, the New Stone Age in Kashmir, which is now found to have very close similarities and cultural exchanges with the early Harappan cultures of Punjab and Haryana. One of the similarities being this motif, the horned deity motif that we used to identify very well with Mohenjo-daro in Harappa. There are a number of other aspects of material culture too. I'm not going into that here. This is the early historic now, northern black polished ware culture. I told you the beginnings of civilization in the Gangetic Valley and the peninsula of India, 6th century BCE, including Kashmir in the north. How do we know this? Findings from the very important site of Semthan in Anantnag, which has revealed the entire ensemble of material remains that is associated with NBPW, including silver punch-marked coins, diagnostic of civilization, early historic civilization in India, including in this ensemble some coins believed to be Mauryan. These are 2 routes, pan-Indic trade and communication and travel routes that existed in India at that time. The Uttara Patha, the northern route in green, and the Dakshina Patha in yellow. I'm showing you this because up north, it goes right up to Takshashila, also Shakalam, which is not shown here. And there were routes from there to Kashmir via passes, via the Budil Pass and the Tosha Maidan Pass. Now here we come to coins, a little later in the early history of Kashmir. This is when Kanishka, that is Kashmir was a part of the Kushan kingdom that I mentioned. These are gold coins issued by the king Kanishka, and what do they say? They say Oesho, dedicated to Shiva. So we are looking at 2nd, 3rd century CE. And you can also see the iconography of the standing king. On the left is a trident as well. I'll show you these in better relief here. 5th century CE, the Kedara kings in Kashmir, King Megavahan, these are his gold base coins. I'm sorry, the image is not very golden, but the coins are very beautiful. What is the iconography? On the left, you see Shiva, the standing Shiva with his trident or Trishula. You can also make out a lion or a tiger sprawled at his feet. Initially, it may look like a horse. You have to look at it for a while to recognize that this is actually a tiger sprawled at its feet. So a very complete iconography already in the 5th century CE. And on the right, you have the seated Lakshmi, the symbol of fecundity, felicity, wealth and power, royal sovereignty in all of India. And she's holding the 2 lotuses in her hand, and the coin says Maharaja, Meghavahana and Jaya, victory in Sanskrit. These are coins of 2 later kings carrying on exactly the same iconographic formulation, which goes on in fact till the 12th century. These are the Lalitaditya Sri Pratap coins. He was known as Sri Pratap as well, and that's what the coins bear, that have been found in massive hoards of hundreds of coins from at least 6 different places in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. These are some, and they're right now in the Sri Pratap Singh Museum in Srinagar. We spoke about Sharda as the descendant, the regional descendant of Brahmi, as it were. This is what it looks like, and this is the provenance of the Sharda script, including inscriptions and manuscripts, coins, and so on. You can see Kashmir had a lot of them, but interestingly, Chamba had almost as many. And even more interestingly, see the entire spread where you have Sharda in circulation. So it's not only about Kashmir, it is Gandhar, which is Peshawar, it is NWFP in Pakistan, it's Jammu, Ladakh, Chamba and Kangra, that's Himachal, right down till Delhi. So you have this entire northwestern configuration, and Kashmir is the fulcrum of it. Gurmukhi and Takri are modern scripts of Punjab and Himachal, are also descendants of Sharda. Now, art. Kumar Kartikeya, one of the earliest images that we have. Bij Bihara, he stands 1.5 meters tall. That's a characteristic of Kashmiri art. Monumental sculpture. You can see the Vanamala, the long garland hanging right down to his knees, and the shorter one right at the top, that is nothing but the Janeu, or the sacred thread. And these are constant features of Kashmiri sculpture for the next 1,000 years. The Ekamukhalingas, Kochi-Tirth, Baramulla, drawing in great detail from the Ekamukhalinga at Udaygiri, next doors to where we are. Colossal lingas in situ in Baramulla. These photographs were taken in the 19th century by Oral Stein, who was surveying Kashmir, as it were. Bhuteshwara. Bhuteshwara is a form of Maheshwara or Shiva, which is unique to Kashmiri iconography, but it does find mention in Pan-Indic Sanskrit manuals of sculpture. What is again interesting, very interesting. Just see the hair formation, the parting in the center. This is known as the window effect for some reason by art historians. And what is interesting about this is that it is found only in Kashmiri sculpture or Nalanda, in no other part of India, indicating and attesting again a very direct correlation in the art repertoires and art styles and art schools of Bihar and Kashmir. The Vaikuntha Vishnu, you can see the tiger and the Varaha avatars on either side of his head, again a distinctly Kashmiri formulation. Today these images are where? In the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. This is a Matrika, Indrani, that is found, a dancing Matrika found from Kashmir. You have 4 or 5 other versions also found, again huge. So the dancing Matrika is again unique to Kashmir. Sorry, can we? Shiva, Parvati, Kartikeya and Ganesh, the entire Shiva family found in large numbers from the Kashmir repertoire. Durga, Mahishasur, Mardini in green schist, Tengapura, Khonamo, 18 goddess. What is the story of this spectacular image? She was stolen and smuggled out of the valley and the country and ended up in Germany, in a museum in Germany. If you exercise your minds, you will recall only about a year ago the government of India brought her back. So now she's safely back in Srinagar. But she is a sight to behold. And 18 Durga Mahishasur Mardini is rare across the country. So we are looking at this panoply of connections, of connected histories across 2,000 years, shaping formative years. What I have tried to show through all of this is that for these 2,000 years, Kashmiri society and culture were open, pluralist, and dynamic. with a great investment in learning and the arts, prioritizing the cultivation of the highest pursuits known to man, at which Kashmiris excel. This is a far cry from the closed, fundamentalist and exclusionist visage that the valley adorns today. The vibrant cosmopolitan histories, the forgotten histories of Kashmir that we have been talking about today have been attempted to be dismantled and its pluralism erased by the violent separatist movement in the valley, leading, I believe, to the deracination of all Kashmiris as a whole. Because an identity that is divorced from history descends into delusion. Though hardly written with that object, ladies and gentlemen, it is hoped that the making of early Kashmir will go some way in forcing our collective attention back to the ancient history of a region that once spearheaded virtually all intellectual and cultural movements across the Indian subcontinent with trademark erudition and brilliance. Thank you very much.
What I would request is identify yourself, try and keep it to a question rather than a comment, because you will have a chance to interact with Shonaleeka later on in the course of the festival also. So we'll try and fit in more questions. I will use my prerogative right at the end to sum up. Right. You need a mic.
Thank you, ma'am. Nice presentation. I'm Tejasvi Nayak. I'm a civil servant based here. I totally agree with this map. I'm ethnically a Kannadiga, so I have going through the literature, Kannada literature. I can say lot of reference about Kashmir. Kashmir Puravasini is a recurring theme. Lot of Kashmiri intellectuals find their reference in Kannada Empire or Karnataka empires. What I have been curious about is, we hear a lot about Lalitaditya Muktabila. But nowhere else we find much reference. He is supposed to be a great conqueror. He is supposed to have reached till Karnataka, though maybe that's in those days the emperors used to claim that they had reached Rameshwaram and all. Why so less information about him? Whereas we know so much about Harsha just before him, Harshvardhana. But
who are you speaking of? You're speaking of the UP Harsha or the Kashmir Harsha?
The Harshvardhana.
So that answers your question. How much do we hear of Kashmir at all in our textbooks? School, college, syllabi, anywhere. I believe, because I have been a student of history all my life, and I have taught history practically for 20 years now, I believe we stopped hearing about Kashmir in our textbooks in the Neolithic, in the New Stone Age, Burza, Home and Gufkral. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think those quaint names remain in our memory even today. We don't hear about Kashmir at all after that, but for a brief reference to Kalhan, and that too appropriated for showing the uniqueness of, showing the first work of history in Sanskrit, which as I argued is itself an entire fallacy. So the 2,000-3,000 years in between or after, where do they find mention? At all in school syllabi or college syllabi. I think this is a shocking oversight. And you can't blame anybody, frankly, for the lack of awareness about all these things we are talking about in Kashmir, which actually leaves the space open for a lot of fake narratives, disinformation, and misleading of people. You'll be happy to know the book has been doing very well. The first edition sold out. This book came out in March and last year, and within 6 months the first edition had sold out. They brought out 2 reprint editions and both of them sold out as well. To me, what is this pointing to? It's pointing to the fact that there is a thirst for knowledge. A lot of people have been very surprised by these findings about Kashmir. And they admit very frankly that they didn't know anything about Kashmir till now, including, and this is the heartwarming part, including people from the valley. I have had rank strangers, not even academics, writing into me, finding me on Facebook, writing in and saying, "Ma'am, thank you, we didn't know this is what the Rajatarangini is about, and this is what our history is about." I've had people from the SPS Museum, the Sri Pratap Singh Museum, the Government Museum of Srinagar, writing and saying, "Thank you, ma'am, for doing this for us." So it is not as if Kashmir is complicit in this conspiracy of silence. I think it falls upon academics of this country and politicians to account for this shocking absence from our school and therefore from our public discourse. I think the root of the problem in Kashmir is a dishonest, uninformed public discourse.
I see a hand back there.
Shonaleeka, that was brilliant. Nothing short of brilliant. It actually required a standing ovation, I would say.
Thank you so much.
I'd say that as an academic, as an educationist in the field, and also a state subject by marriage and some kind of historian. My name is Babli Moitra Saraf, Bengali, married into Jammu Kashmir. Have written a bit on Rajouri in a memoir called Rajouri Remembered. But apart from that, you have very kindly called the omission of Kashmir from, you may almost say, public memory or educational memory as an oversight. Would you consider that as an erasure rather than an oversight? Because erasure has political and cultural implications, whereas oversight can be, a lesser, perhaps, mistake. And the other thing that I want to ask, may I please, with the permission of the chair, that you have spoken about Kashmir, its culture and its Indic connections, but by virtue of its geography, by the virtue of its placement itself, it must have had outward movements too, some of which we know about, and to what extent that also created a kind of frontier culture which transcended the politics and argued for a new kind of sovereignty in those places, or even the lack of it. And which perhaps is what is drawn upon when now very fashionably we talk about Kashmiriyat. I don't know, I'm speaking from a position of ignorance, but there must have been another overlap outward because of its sheer geographical positioning.
Okay, I'm going to take that second question first. When I started this research, very frankly, I was as conditioned as perhaps all of you are to expect to find that Kashmir was always a hybrid culture. Because, as you said, geographically she is adjacent to more than one cultural regime. She has the Tibeto-Burman cultural regime in the northeast. She has Central Asian, Scythian and so on movements. She has the Iranian cultural regime to her west. And as I said, we have been given to believe entirely retrospectively, that Kashmir was a West Asian and Central Asian culture. Is. That is the identity of Kashmir as far as we knew. But when you look at the sources, which is what I sat to do in my research, one by one, all of them, they were not speaking to a cultural hybridity at all. I discovered that this hybridity, or this frontier culture, or this borderland, this peripheral culture that is lent to Kashmir, or to places like Assam, for example, in the northeast, is really the scholar's creation. When you go to the sources on the ground, they are not giving you a story of any kind of hyphenated cultural regimes at all. Having said that, your question began by asking, wasn't there also an outward movement? Extensively. Outward and inward. You have a lot of traders, you have a lot of people coming from other parts of the world, not just Central Asia into Kashmir, and you have a lot of Kashmiris going out. But the question really is not whether there was movement or not. Of course there was, that is my whole argument. The question is, what was the direction of influence? Was it an incoming cultural influence? If it was, why doesn't it show in the sources? Or was it an outgoing influence? Was it Kashmir who was actually the fountainhead? She was a fount of Indic culture, carrying it all over Central and West Asia, and was understood to be that. So when you have the Chinese traveller Xuanzang coming in the 7th century, and he enters India through Kashmir, he's standing west of Khyber Pass at a moment in his narrative. He's standing in a place called Nagarhara, ancient Nagarhara, modern Jalalabad, which is just west of Khyber, which means well west of the Indus, well west of Pakistan. And what does he say? He says, I'm standing at the gateway to Hindu. And what is Hindu? No, I'm sorry, it's not the Indus Plains, because he describes what Hindu is. He says she is the nation that lies between the Himalayas and the 3 oceans. which is the traditional way in which India has always been described. He says Indu is 90,000 li huge. We are not talking of only the Indus plains. And he says Indu has 70 different kingdoms at least. So he's very clearly talking of India. But what is my point? My point is that for Xuanzang in the 8th, 7th, 8th century, India, the Indic cultural regime began west of Khyber Pass. And it is Kashmir that was actually carrying Indic influences into this border area and beyond. So my whole argument is that of course there was a lot of give and take, but the giving, Kashmir was doing the giving, she was not doing so much of the taking from outside of India.
We have a question here because we are running out of time.
Arun Gurtu, a retired police officer. Some time back I read a book, Sufi Saints in Medieval Kashmir. This was entirely a translation from Persian. So obviously, whereas the local thing was suppressed, there's a lot of things about Kashmir in the Persian literature. Do you find so?
No, of course, sir. But we are talking history here. We are talking till the 12th century CE is what I'm speaking about. 13th, 14th century is a threshold period in the history of Kashmir. Huge transitions, demographic, the nature of that demography, religion, culture, rulership. There are a lot of breaks, a lot of disjunctions. And that begins with the 14th century and continues till now. But the Persian aspects of Kashmiri culture are something we all know about. It's something that's seen as synonymous with Kashmiri today, with Kashmiri crafts, for example. It is the forgotten histories preceding that we have been looking at today. So no one is, of course, denying Persian histories, but we can't retrospectively assume that's all there was to Kashmiri history.
There's a lot more to Kashmiri history and a lot more we can talk about, but there is the last question, sir.
I'll have the last question, ma'am. My name is General Atta Hassan. I'm the Chancellor of the Central University of Kashmir and former GOC of the 15th Corps. Fascinating presentation of yours, absolutely. One observation and very short question, I expect just short answers to. The first observation is that from your presentation, obviously the role of geography on the intellectual development of Kashmir has been very distinct. I don't know whether much research has been done on the fact that one of the major routes into Kashmir and out of Kashmir is the Jhelum Valley. The existence of the Data Mandir there.
Absolutely.
Existence of so many shrines there, and Baramulla as the center of learning. Because that is the place from where the Jhelum actually enters the gorge and goes down to Muzaffarabad.
Right.
That's one aspect.
That's where Xuanzang actually came into.
Now my question to you primarily is, what was the influence of the Silk Route? The Silk Route on the development of intellectual aspects of Kashmir, number one. And number two, I am a member of the Sharda Peeth Committee. We are trying to develop a pilgrimage to the Sharda Peeth's shrine in the Neelam Valley.
Fantastic.
But we've got obstacles in front of us because that shrine is right in the middle, right next to the line of control,
Yes.
In the Neelam Valley.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little more, because I don't think in this audience many people will know anything about Sharda Peeth. What is Sharda culture as far as Kashmir is concerned, and what is the significance of the Sharda Peeth?
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting questions, huge questions, and we don't have the time for that. Having said that, I'll respond very quickly. So the Silk Route and Kashmir. Again, another one of the perhaps misconceptions, that Kashmir was on the Silk Route. She was not on the Silk Route, the Great Silk Route, ever. So let's get that clear. And if you look at the geography, you'll see she couldn't have been, because she's actually far south of the Great Silk Route. What did happen is that traders, products, ideas and so on from Kashmir went via at least 5 or 6 major passes, as the general has been naming one of them. There are at least 4 or 5 others. So via Gilgit and Hunza in the north, as well as via Nubra Valley and Sojida through Ladakh. Via these passes and via these routes, then further routes will connect with the southern branch of the Silk Route at Yarkand, Kashgar and Kufra. So Kashmir is not directly on the Silk Route at all. Was there an influence of the cultures along the Silk Route on Kashmir's intellectual development? I'm still searching. As I said, I was personally very surprised. I'm being entirely honest. I had named my manuscript already, liminal landscapes. I expected Kashmir to be this liminal culture on the limits of the Indian cultural regime, and didn't turn out to be that at all. So if there was any such influence, I would be happy to learn about it. Sharda Peeth, I made a couple of very quick references to it. Clearly, she enjoyed an iconic stature across the subcontinent. You had pilgrims coming from across India as early as the 8th century. So much for communication being a problem in early India. It clearly wasn't. I also mentioned Al-Biruni reckons her to be her along with Somnath as among the top 3 shrines of Al-Hind. So she has this pan-Indic stature. What is really interesting about the Sharda Peeth is that she was associated, the Peeth is associated with the goddess Sharda, who is Saraswati, who is the goddess of learning. And the Sharda Peeth was called the Sarvagya Peetha. The Peeth, the center of omniscience, the center of all knowledge systems, which is what makes no less than Adi Shankaracharya end and culminate his peregrinations across this landmass at Kashmir. And there is this whole debate that occurs at the Sharda Peeth because a variety of other great minds of India and Central Asia try to ascend the Sarvagya Peetha at Sharda. They all fail, and only Shankara is able to do that. To me, this is a symbolic rendition. It's a symbolic claim to the supremacy, the intellectual supremacy and suzerainty, as it were, of Kashmir over the subcontinent, the sway that she had. So, to me, Sharda Peeth was not simply a place of pilgrimage. She really captures what Kashmir was, the heart, throbbing pulse of sharp, very sharp intellect and culture in early India.
Thank you. That gives me my cue, because you have captured the essence of what Kashmir was to the mind of ancient, not just ancient India, but India. It doesn't matter what the physical geography is, yes, but she was central. And I think you've been able to do that in a brilliant way. I will keep my closing remarks really short. I have the authority to sort of stretch it, but I won't. It's not fair to the others. What is also interesting is the point that you raised, that what is often not taken, there are too many regional aspects that we call regional, but they are all essential to what goes towards the making of our minds. The cultural identity of India, the cultural identity of the world, anything. So if we know very little about aspects of Kashmir, we know very little about aspects of Karnataka, of Guwahati, Assam, that part of the world. Everything has to be kind of distilled for textbooks, which means we now have the opportunity to read in books like yours. And if you feel we haven't touched on the Rajatarangini, and we haven't really, now's your chance to go out and get a copy of the book and look at it like this. There are earlier translations which would be, as you mentioned earlier, one-sided. My being overfair to my colleague here. But again, thank you very much for this presentation. As I said, we could go on forever. We should go on forever. There's a question probably, but I think we'll have to put it. Is it all right?
Just an extension, as Shonaleeka would know, but just to respond to the general, that the Sharda script is also the Bengali script.
Right, thank you for that, because I did want to bring in the fact that, so in Rajasthan, Dodd is one of the things they refer to, and then they denigrate and whatever. And one of the things is, of course, Dodd wouldn't write or read any Indian language, because in this very British style, he says, my guru is an adept at, he mentions several things, Armavdi, and then he says, and the old Saraswati. And I muddle along. So I'm bringing this in to say that his guru, the Yati, in the 19th century, could read the old Sharda script. And so it was still after 300 years or 200 years of having more or less died out. Sorry, I keep looking at that end of the audience. I'll look at you now as I say. Thank you very much for being a wonderful audience.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching the session from BLF 2019. Kindly subscribe to our channel for more such videos.